Hello and welcome to World Talks on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Since the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2014, its human rights violations, hybrid threats, and annexation of Crimea and of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions, the West has imposed 18 packages of sanctions on that country. However, the Russian war machine seems unaffected and the West seems ineffectual. Do sanctions work? And if not, what alternatives exist? Well, to address these questions, we're joined by Kinga Redłowska. She's head of the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI Europe. Kinga, welcome to TVP World and thank you very much for taking the time. Now, the message that everyone seems to be hearing is, well, you know, the EU keeps imposing these sanctions and Russia keeps saying, well, it makes no difference to us, just watch us wage war. Your thoughts?
Well, certainly Russian officials, when commenting on Western sanctions, rely on key few narratives. They point to the fact that sanctions backfired because they actually increased domestic production and hence made Russian economy more independent. They also often claim that the continued trade with non-Western partners is just yet another proof that the efforts of the West to isolate Russian economy have failed. And of course, when presenting all those narratives, they are using very selective indicators and so painting a false picture, a sort of facade of a resilient economy.
So if I understand you correctly, Kinga, what you're saying is that there is a bit of a disparity between what Russia is saying and the real impact on its economy and its ability to wage war. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And of course, Russia is trying hard to project to its own citizens that it has been resilient, the economy is immune, just to hide the fact that it actually turned into a war economy. The sole fact they are paying so much attention to hide the impact of sanctions and Russian isolation means that sanctions are working and achieving some of the goals they were supposed to receive. Having said that, obviously the G7 sanctions coalition could always do better.
Okay, now in talk, you mentioned the G7 sanctions coalition. How good have they been at passing the message around? Because, you know, 18 packages since 2014 and nothing seems to be happening. I mean, the West is saying, well, what's the point of sanctions?
I do think that the West and especially the EU had not been as good as it should be at messaging around sanctions, both to its internal domestic audience, but also externally to the countries of the global South. So when we look into the populations of the European states that imposed sanctions, at the very beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion, when the sanctions were rolled out, first packages, there was a lot of adjectives used to signal that those sanctions are unprecedented. And so based on those adjectives, a lot of journalists picked that up. And then the messaging was that the aim of the sanction is to crush the Russian economy. Whereas the aims and the goals and the theory of change behind the G7 sanctions was very different from the beginning. They have been actually two main goals of those sanctions. The first one has been to reduce the revenue Russia is generating to fuel its war machine, and secondly, to reduce access to dual-use goods so that they can advance in their military equipment. So these were the core goals of G7 sanctions. But unfortunately, especially at the beginning, the messaging was sort of raising hopes of the internal here European populations that somehow those sanctions rolled out over the last more than 3 years will dramatically change Russian economy.
The other aspect, of course, when it comes to the EU, the G7 and so on, is the infighting that we see and the watering down of proposals and so on, and also, of course, the time it takes for the sanctions to be introduced. That, I guess, is not helping the narrative, is it?
It's not helping the narrative, and that's something that the especially European Union needs to manage, especially in light of the fact that sanctions are here to stay. And whether we are talking sanctions on Russia or sanctions on individual or other countries, they will be increasingly a part of foreign policy toolkit. And so this lack of consensus that we see every 6 months in Brussels when the sanctions are reimposed, and for this there needs to be across the bloc consensus, is definitely making some of us getting a small heart attack. This is especially sensitive when we are thinking about not so much those the list of the various financial sanctions and sanctions on a number of dual-use goods, but specifically about the freezing of Russian central bank's asset. The fact that sanctions, that the Russian central bank assets have been freezed, these decisions needs to be renewed by the European Union on a unilateral basis. So all 27 countries need to reinforce those sanctions every 6 months. And of course, countries such as Hungary or Slovakia are very often just around those summits, around those decisions, raising some narratives that they might not do it, that they want some concessions to be made, some benefits for them if they vote again in favor of sustaining the freeze.
Understood. So there is some disparity in the arguments within the EU which delay. Now, we had Kira Rudik, Ukrainian member of parliament, on recently, and she said, well, it's not about only having the sanctions, but about enforcement of those sanctions. How well do you think the West has enforced the sanctions that it has already imposed?
Indeed, I would fully agree with this statement. Enforcing sanctions is something very new, especially such an unprecedented and complicated sanctions is something new for the European Union specifically. Of course, the United States that have imposed various sanctions on various countries and entities historically, they have already developed tools that help them enforce those sanctions more effectively. For example, secondary sanctions. The Americans, they also have their own institution, OFAC, that is well respected worldwide, and the fear of being sanctioned by OFAC is a strong deterrent to circumvent sanctions. The EU historically has not been imposing sanctions so extensively, and therefore only with the Russian sanctions, the whole machine, the tools have been developed across the EU member states. Because once again, it's important to underline that sanctions are designed in Brussels, but implemented by every member states of the European Union individually based on their domestic frameworks. And those frameworks, they have had to adjust to this challenge of such a wide array of sanctions. And the EU has done some good job on this, but definitely there's a room for improvement. And just finally, there is a difference. There are two sort of areas that we should look into when we talk about the effective enforcement of sanctions. First is, how are we doing here back at home? How the European governments work with European operators with European producers to make sure they don't export those forbidden goods to Russia or to countries known of high risk or circumvention. And secondly, the enforcement relies on diplomatic relations with so-called third countries and how the European Union engages with them to encourage them to actually help G7 sanctions coalition to make those sanctions effective.
Understood. Now, outside this group of countries that you've alluded to, there is an axis, if you like, of countries which specialize in sanctions busting. North Korea and Iran come to mind. But China is also amongst them, and of course, Russia. How effective are they at actually getting around the sanctions? So it doesn't really matter how many sanctions, the West imposes on Russia, it'll still find a way around using or leveraging its relationships with those countries.
Yes, it's a good question. Sanctions implementation and therefore circumvention is a constant dynamic process. So as the G7 sanctions coalition countries, they adapt, they enforce new sanctions. Also, the adversaries, they also adapt and learn new ways to circumvent those sanctions. And so, as you mentioned, DPRK, Iran, Russia, and China are increasingly working to circumvent them. With time, this cooperation is becoming more and more advanced, and they are also creating new tools that help circumvent those sanctions. For example, alternative financial systems, but also when it comes to the oil price cap, the shadow fleet, and a parallel trading system that supports the shadow fleet.
Indeed, indeed. And now, I know it's very early days and the damage is still being assessed in Iran to Iran's nuclear facilities, but there is a relationship between Russia and Iran. How, if at all, do you think the sanctions on Russia might be impacted by this attack?
Well, definitely there is a nexus between G7 sanctions on Russia and Iran when it comes to energy trade. Enforcing oil price cap and more broadly maritime sanctions that apply both to Russia and Iran, there's a huge nexus here. And so there's going to be an impact, definitely. Facilitators that help both Iran and Russia circumvent Western sanctions on energy trade are using the same infrastructure, very often the same vessels, the same network of enablers. And so there's going to be an interesting dynamic, and it's, of course, yet to be seen how this is going to work in practice. But I guess a couple next days will tell us a bit more on this.
Indeed, we shall be watching closely, and we hope you'll come back and share your analysis with our audience. Again, thank you again for taking the time, and have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me. Good day.
Pleasure. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though. Lots more coming up. Goodbye.